Last week was Groundhog's Day, and I talked about new beginnings, and how we're kind of like the groundhog sometimes, that it's kind of hard for us to come out of our little holes in the ground. It's kind of hard for us to stick our necks out. And when we do, quite often we look around and we see our shadows. And our shadows might scare us. But perhaps we can turn around and look towards the light instead of looking at our shadows. And whether we do something now or do something later, spring will come. Spring will come. And so last week I was talking about a new beginning, and this week I'd like to talk about 3 new beginnings. And it's kind of strange to call the first ones new because one of them happened 2,000 years ago and the other one happened 70 years ago. And so the first one is that beginning with Jesus. The day that Jesus was out with the crowds, and the crowds were pressing so hard that he got into the boat with the fishermen and preached from the boat. We know that story. We've heard it many times. And it comes around for me to preach on every 2 or 3 years. And I really don't mind having that one over and over again. It's a good story. It has several things. There's quite a few points there that I can usually take 2 or 3 of them and preach on. I'll just tell you what the points are today, because you've heard these sermons a few times. One is that some things are really difficult to do. And sometimes we fish all night. And sometimes the difficult things we do, we work really hard on. And what we expected to happen and what we hope to happen doesn't happen. Some things that are worth doing even if we're not sure that they're going to work out. It's like letting the nets down into the water, and maybe there'll be fish there and maybe there won't, but we're not going to catch anything if we don't let down the nets. And then there's this other angle that we can preach on that's about the people and Jesus. Jesus was out there and the crowds were coming to him. They wanted to see him. They wanted to get to know who Jesus was. They wanted to hear God's word. And that's probably true of a lot of people out there today. And it goes beyond what they wanted. It goes to what they needed. They needed to hear God's word, and Jesus was providing that for him. And after he had given his teaching, Jesus said to the fishermen, "Put your nets down." They said, "We've tried it all night. We haven't caught anything." But Peter says, if you tell us to, we'll do it. So they put the nets down. And they caught so many fish that they couldn't get them into the boat. So they called to their friends. And their friends came down and helped get the nets back into the boat. And there were so many fish that the boat was sinking. And one of the problems with the new beginning is that if it really works, it creates new problems. But sometimes it's necessary to throw our nets out in a different way than we did before. Sometimes when we're even discouraged, it's a good thing to try again. And Jesus, okay, I'm backing up. I'm hitting 3 points at once. But Peter's response to seeing this was to say to Jesus, "Go away, I'm a sinful man." He did what the groundhog did. He came out into the light and all of a sudden saw his own shadows. But Jesus presented the light and said, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you'll be fishing for people." And so they left everything and they went and followed him. And Jesus put them into the work of gathering people together and sharing the good news. And if someone hadn't been doing that for the past 20 generations, no, correct that, that's 50 generations. 5 generations to a century, 100 generations. Wow. It's been a long time. But in each of those generations, there have been people who have told the good news of Jesus and gathered people into community and passed it on. And eventually it's come down to us. And if they hadn't done that, well, may not have been here today. And of course, the whole point is we may need to throw our nets in a new way. So the story of Jesus and the fishermen is just one of the new beginnings that I want to talk about today. Another is more recent. It was only 70 years ago. You can remember 70 years, can't you? It's a little more than I can remember, but not much more than I can remember. And that's the starting of Hillcrest Church. There aren't a lot of artifacts that we have from that starting, that meeting on February 2nd, but we do have words. And somebody wrote them down, and somebody else wrote them down, and they got written into a big book, and then they got typed up. And we still have those words. We have the minutes of that first meeting, and I'd like to read parts of those to you. And we can consider this sacred scripture as well. This is a part of the story of Christ's church. An organizational meeting was held at 8 p.m. on February 2nd, 1955 at the home of Schuyler Hoffman, 15156 La Calma Drive, Whittier, California, to consider and implement the forming of an East Whittier Congregational Church. And then they list out the names of the people who were there. I believe there's a flyer in your bulletin that has those names included with this. After informal discussion pointing up the need for a congregational church in the East Whittier area, Dr. Barwick outlined the usual procedure for the forming of a new church as set forth in the Congregational Church Manual. It was decided that a temporary organization should be formed pending the later formation of a permanent church. All those present signed their names to a statement signifying their desire to join such a temporary organization. It was agreed that this list would be expanded by inviting all other interested persons to sign and participate. These minutes continue. That's only about half of that meeting. The rest of the meeting is business stuff, like who's going to be our chairperson? They said, Mr. Robbins can be our chairperson. He wasn't at that meeting according to the list, but maybe he showed up after they took attendance. But by the next meeting, he was the chair, and they also nominated Bess Moore to take minutes, and she accepted and was elected, and all of the things in the old book are in her handwriting for several years. So it's business things like that. And we usually don't find minutes to be really exciting reading, but it is an exciting story, and I'll tell you more about that probably the second Sunday of each month for the next 2 or 3 or 4 months, and maybe again in the fall. But my focus today is on those minutes of the first meeting. And I'd like to look closely at those as to what they were doing at the very beginning, while starting to look at another beginning. And this other beginning is one that starts right now. And I don't know just what shape it takes. Every moment we have together is a new beginning. Every time we gather for worship, each day we wake up, it's a new beginning. But I'd like to take that start back then and think about what it might mean for us. They met at the home of Schuyler Hoffman. And there's a couple of things I'd like to say about that. One is this big Bible that's up here on the pulpit, up on the altar. If you look inside the front cover, there's a little book plate that says it was given by Schuyler and Ellen Hoffman in honor of their parents. So this Bible comes from the folks who hosted that first meeting. We never know what the effects will be of the choices we make, but there it is. And I'd also like to point out that at that point, there were this little group of 16 people. They didn't have a building, they didn't have a place to meet, but they were already thinking about that. They were already thinking about getting land. They were already thinking about putting up a building. And They grew rapidly, but the community came first. And they purchased the land and they created the building to go around the people. There's an old children's song. The church is not a building. The church is not a steeple. The church is not a resting place. The church is people. I am the church, you are the church, we are the church together. All who follow Jesus all around the world, we are the church together. So that's one of the thoughts I want us to hold on to. We are a church. We have a facility. And the facility is kind of shaped around us. After informal discussion, pointing up the need for a congregational church in the East Whittier area, Dr. Barwick outlined the usual procedure for the forming of a new church as set forth in the Congregational Church Manual. It's just business, isn't it? No, let's look at it. They were looking ahead, and they knew that what they wanted to do would be a major undertaking. They wanted to form a church and start something new. They had a vision of something that didn't exist yet, and they were willing to work toward it. They were also willing to think carefully about what they wanted to do and how they would do it. They started with an informal discussion pointing up the need for a congregational church in the Whittier area. They saw this not just as what they wanted, or even just as what they needed, but what the area needed. In their minds, the area needed a congregational church. So why would the area need a congregational church? To look at that, we need to think a little bit about what is a congregational church. And there's many answers to this question, but they come in two different categories. First is what's called polity. That's the fancy word for it. But all polity means is the way we organize to get things done. In a congregational church, the biggest questions are settled by a vote of the congregation as a whole. The members, all of us together, form a non-profit corporation. That's who we are legally. And this corporation, us together, own the property and own the building. And as a spiritual organization, we come together as a fellowship and we decide our approach to faith. We decide what we're going to believe and how we're going to believe it. The church together decides who you want for a pastor. You decide who you want for a moderator and a church council. And the church together creates this bunch of things called bylaws, which are basically the church deciding how the church is going to operate. In a congregational system, the denomination is a whole bunch of little pieces, local churches, that covenant together to work together as something bigger. In the Constitution of the United Church of Christ, the National United Church of Christ, it says the basic unit of the church is the local congregation. We're all the building blocks that put all that together. We're the living stones. Now, that all seems really ordinary to most of us, but in a Methodist church or an Episcopal church, the local fellowship is just an expression of the bigger organization. It's more like the branch of a bank. The building and the land are owned by the regional organization. In the Catholic Church, the building and the land are owned by the world organization and taken care of by the diocese. The diocese decides how things are going to be done. And there's some freedom within the local churches and in churches like that, but there's also a set of rules, there's a set of policies, there's a set of doctrines that are handed down, and there's a set of beliefs. And if you want to be a part of the church, you say, yes, I believe that. I believe that. And those are established not on the local level, but on the wider level. In an Episcopal church or a Catholic church or a Methodist church, you've got a bishop, and it's really handy because that bishop tells you who your priest or your pastor is going to be. It's much easier that way. But if all this sounds strange to you or even a little bit restrictive, then deep in your heart, in some way, you are a Congregationalist. If you have the sense that it should be the local church that decides these things. Now, in the Christian church, it takes it a step further in emphasizing the freedom of each particular person to believe as they do and work together in spite of the differences. And in most United Church of Christs, that's the same. It is here. We encourage you to believe what you believe and to live according to it, and we'll talk about it. We'll be iron against iron. We'll sharpen each other sometimes. But that's really a decision of the congregation. A congregational church could decide that you're all going to believe what the pastor believes, and everybody else can leave. Most don't. So part of what they were saying when they said, we think this community needs a congregational church, they meant that they needed a church that was locally organized and run by the people who were a part of that church, where there was freedom of belief and freedom of that church to do what it believed was right. So that's part of what it meant to be congregational. Now there's an old saying that if you've been in one congregational church, or if you've been in one United Church of Christ, you've been in, not all of them, but you've been in one congregational church or one United Church of Christ. If you go to different ones, they'll be somewhat different. And local churches do have choices about what kind of churches they can be. You can be a congregational church and be very conservative. You can be a congregational church and be very liberal. You can be a congregational church and be a mix. But within the congregational churches, within the choices that were available to them, a lot of congregational churches made similar choices. A lot of the congregational pastors went to the same seminaries and brought the same ideas into the church. They had publishing houses, so, most congregational churches had the Pilgrim Hymnal and were teaching from congregational Sunday school materials, which tends to shape the children so they grow up and then they're confirmed in congregational ways. Same things I'm sure was happening in the Christian church, which also has a lot of freedom. But each denomination develops its own culture and its own way of doing things, so that even though there is the freedom to be very different within a free church like the Christian church or the Congregational church, if you walk into another one, it's likely to be familiar. And in 1955, that was even more likely to be true. You'd open it up and you'd see your home hymnal right there. And the preacher would say things a lot like your home preacher said. And you'd feel at home, and if you identified yourself as saying, I came from the Congregational church and such, they say, oh yeah, we know that church, come on in. You're a part of us. There was a welcome. So part of what they meant when they said the church needed a congregational church was that there were people in the community who were familiar with Congregationalism, and they'd be looking for that kind of church. You could say the same thing about First Christian. There were Christians around looking for that. But this leads some big questions for who we are as Hillcrest. Does our area need a church like Hillcrest? We'd like them to need a church like Hillcrest. Do the people in the area want a church like Hillcrest? We are still congregational in the sense that we determine the style of worship and the programs we serve and all those things. And you together are the ones who decide who you want in the pulpit. So does the community want the church that we've chosen to be? Or is there something else that the community needs in the way of a church that we'd be willing to provide them, even if it isn't just who we are? And this goes beyond what the people of the community want. It goes to, what do we believe the people of the community need? Medicine does not always taste as good as candy, and it's less fun than candy. But medicine heals. And candy rots the teeth and harms the body in many ways. If what is provided is what is needed, it will do good in the community, and it'll do spiritual good in the lives of the people who come into it. And though they may not be looking for that, eventually, if it's presented to them, it'll be recognized and appreciated. The minutes of the organizing meeting of 1955 continue. It was decided that a temporary organization should be formed pending the later formation of the permanent church. They didn't just jump in and say, okay, we're a church now. They said, we are a group of people who want to start a church, and it's going to be different than what we are now. All of those present signed their names to a statement signifying their desire to join such a temporary organization. It was agreed that the list would be expanded by inviting all other interested persons to sign and participate. Being a temporary organization might be a good way of thinking of ourselves. And it's not really anything new. When Hillcrest first formed, there were this little group of people, and they knew they were temporary because there'd be something else. And then there was this really rapidly growing group of people that were very ambitious and very generous and very willing to work to create a church. It became a community of church builders, and it's amazing how quickly they pulled that off. I'll talk about that in coming weeks. But then Hillcrest came what, from our point of view, is a big church. 600, 700 members, 200 or 300 members here worshiping on a regular basis, sometimes probably more than that. Able to run several big programs at the same time, able to start an art festival, able to start a school, able to do all these things because they really needed to have something to do. It was no longer a group of church builders, it was a group of church people. And they were reaching out into the community and offering all these things. And so then there were people who were coming who needed the things that a church offered. And that's also different than the people who need to be offering something. And so for many years there was both of these. There was those who were running the programs and providing all the good, and then there were those who were bringing their families in so their kids would have a place to be, and those who wanted to hear good music so they came and listened, and those who wanted good worship so they came to worship with us. But that's also different. And there wasn't the attention over the years to how do we get more people? How do we get more people? So the church grew smaller, still faithfully serving all the way along. And it became a mid-sized church, and then a small church, and now we're a fellowship. And here we are, and I don't mention this very often because all of us are young at heart, and we all like to think we're going to live forever. But how many of us are going to be around to be the church in 10 years? How many of us are going to be able to do the things that need to be done? We are a temporary organization with some incredible resources and some incredible things that we can do. But we need to be thinking as that small group, that if Hillcrest is to continue or if it is going to be reborn into something else, we're that group that helps that happen, that holds that dream as to what it can be. It may be that every local church is a temporary organization. Terry and I went and visited some beautiful churches while we were in Great Britain and in Scotland. And some of them were just ruins, open to the air. The stone of something that looked like a cathedral weathering away and parts of it falling down every few years. Others were essentially museums, very well maintained, full of history, full of wonderful things, with thousands of tourists coming through them every day, but with perhaps a very small group of people meeting there to worship. A place that had hold 10,000 worshipers, with a fellowship of 500 meeting each Sunday. And then there were churches that were in very old buildings that were still very vibrant, carrying on great ministries. They were full to the brim. And even there, though, the people who are members now were not members there 100 years ago, and they won't be members there 100 years from now. They were constantly in this process of inviting people in, of becoming that new church, which might not be the same now as it was 50 years ago, and definitely won't be the same 50 years from now as it is now. And even within a church, strange thing, that when somebody passes away or somebody moves away, all of a sudden we're not the church we were before. And every time somebody comes in and makes themselves a part of the church, we're a different fellowship than we were before, with different ideas and different dreams. The church is constantly being reborn as something new and different, with new gifts and a new purpose. The old has passed away, the new has come. Yet there is a sense in which the church is universal and lasting and durable. It seems as one kind of church dies away, a new one is born. It's very persistent. If we don't see ourselves growing into a church that fills this room again, then we have things to think about. We could continue to share our building, that's an option. Or we could sell it and use the proceeds in creative and productive ways that are consistent with the faith and mission of the church. We could sell the facility at a discount to an organization or a church that we wish to give a big head start. And of all these, the only outcome that scares me is that we might disband or just fade away without directing the assets of the church to either another church or to another cause that we want to support and that's appropriate to the mission and purpose of this church. And of course, there's the possibility we could refill this room, that we could grow again to a church that's appropriate to have this kind of facility. But if we want to do that, we have to get over the idea that it's just going to happen someday. We got lucky with First Christian. You folks all joined us, and it was a wonderful boost, and it still is a wonderful boost. And maybe there are 100 people out there who just want to come in and join us. But much more likely, it would take a lot of work and a lot of creative energy and a lot of inviting. One of the things that Dr. Barwick said to the people at the very beginning when they were forming committees, one of the committees was the Church Growth Committee, and nobody wanted to be on it, and he said, remember, all of you are on the Church Growth Committee. If we want to be that small church that starts a bigger church again, we've got some planning and some hard work to do, and that is a choice. If the fellowship we know as Hillcrest is to grow, we need to have a clear idea of what kind of church we want it to grow into. And it needs to be something that we need to do, and it needs to be something that others need, something that will motivate us, but also motivate others to join, that they'll want to be a part of. And it's not just enough for them to want to be a part of, it needs to be something that's good for them to join, something that's good for Christ for them to join. If we can find that spark, then maybe there's a possibility.